It was on a gusty February morning when the soot-laced wind rattled against the frosted panes of Baker Street that our quiet was interrupted by the arrival of a most peculiar gentleman. The fire had only just begun to crackle to life when the bell below gave two sharp peals, followed by a hesitant knock upon the sitting-room door. Sherlock Holmes had been in one of his more introspective moods that morning, sprawled on the couch with a worn violin cradled beneath his arm, one string tuned flat as an auditory distraction. I had taken up the Times, though I admit my eyes lingered more on the classified notices than on politics. The mood was domestic and still, broken only by the faint wheeze of the wind against the chimney. Mrs. Hudson entered with a raised eyebrow. "A gentleman from the Foreign Office, Mr. Holmes." "He insists it is a matter of urgency." Holmes did not move at first, only flicked his hand lazily in the air. "Send him up, Mrs. Hudson. Perhaps he brings us something more invigorating than the insipid tea you've been pouring, Watson." Moments later, in stepped a man of stiff bearing, his overcoat still dusted with snow, his gloves removed but clutched tightly in one hand, as though to fend off imagined threats. He wore a neatly combed moustache and the sheen of a man more accustomed to diplomatic parlours than fog-drenched streets. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume?" the man said briskly. "I am Lionel Beechcroft, Under-Secretary to the Eastern Affairs Desk." Holmes sat up with a cat-like interest. "And what has occurred, Mr. Beechcroft, in the tangled realm of Eastern diplomacy that demands the skills of a mere consulting detective?" Beechcroft hesitated, glancing at me. "You may speak freely before Dr. Watson," Holmes interjected. "He is the fixed point in my increasingly rotating universe." With a tight nod, Beechcroft stepped closer and produced a thin leather portfolio. "I am here on behalf of Sir Reginald Fanshawe, Permanent Secretary to the Foreign Office and Director of a particular compartmentalized bureau. Last night, one of our confidential briefings was scheduled to take place at a discreet property on Porton Terrace, near Westminster. It was meant to be a secure debriefing between Sir Reginald and a foreign attaché. The attaché never arrived. Not altogether unusual in diplomatic circles, Holmes murmured. Beechcroft's voice dropped. Under ordinary circumstances, no, but what alarms us is what Sir Reginald discovered in the drawing-room afterwards. The interior of the room was exactly as arranged, chairs placed before a hearth, refreshments untouched, but the east-facing casement window had been cracked across its centre, a jagged fracture. Oddly, it had not shattered, despite being struck with considerable force from the outside. Watson leaned forward. A stone, perhaps? Possibly. But nothing was found outside, no stone, no footprint in the snow beneath the sill. The glass was struck, but not broken. We had it examined before sunrise. The glazier said it was not ordinary glass. It had been treated with a certain resilience, a mixture used for embassy panes, but the blow required significant force. And Beechcroft hesitated again. Holmes steepled his fingers. "You are omitting something. A note was found inside the crack." At this, Holmes's eyes glinted. It was pressed tightly within the fracture, as though inserted by some mechanism or with surgical precision. A slip of paper, rolled fine and burned at the edges. Watson frowned. What did it say? Beechcroft opened the portfolio and drew out a sealed envelope. It was written in French, badly, a cipher perhaps. Sir Reginald insists it must not be circulated or handled through official channels. He believes someone is attempting to send a message bypassing all protocols. Holmes reached out and took the envelope. And the message was inserted without entry into the house? Precisely. The door was locked, no sign of tampering. Sir Reginald had stepped into the next room for no more than 4 minutes. When he returned, the note was in the window. Holmes chuckled softly. Fascinating. An unbroken window bearing a crack with a smuggled note lodged within during a secret meeting that never occurred. He turned the envelope in his long fingers, sniffed its seal, and then held it up to the firelight. "Watson, the scent of sulphur, do you detect it?" I took the envelope and gave it a cautious sniff. "Yes, and gunpowder?" "Curious," Holmes said. "Mr. Beechcroft, was this meeting known to anyone outside your most secure circle?" "Absolutely no one." "Then the question is not merely how the message entered, but why such theatricality was used in its delivery. Why not slip it beneath the door? Why strike the window with force just sufficient to crack, not shatter?" Beechcroft cleared his throat. "Sir Reginald hoped you might investigate discreetly. Scotland Yard has not been informed." Holmes stood abruptly and strode to the window. The Baker Street fog pressed against the panes like a living thing. "I shall visit Porton Terrace within the hour," Holmes declared. "In matters where the glass does not break but the surface is disturbed, we must consider not merely the material, but the messenger. Watson, you will accompany me?" I nodded at once, my heart already quickened. Beechcroft exhaled. "Then I shall inform Sir Reginald. He is awaiting your assessment." As our guest departed, Holmes moved to his desk and unlocked the drawer with practised ease. From it he drew a small lens and a set of vials. "Watson," he said, as he packed his tools, "there is something very wrong about a window that will not break, and a note that burns at the edges but spares the room." I said nothing, but I knew. The game, once again, was afoot. The hansom cab rattled eastward through the slush-ridden streets of Westminster, past street lamps still burning faintly in the mid-morning fog. London wore its grey veil thickly that day, and the clatter of hooves echoed like gunfire through alleyways slick with soot. Holmes sat opposite me, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the window, fingers laced beneath his chin, in the pose I had long come to recognize as his signal for deepest contemplation. Neither of us spoke for a stretch of time. Then, without shifting his posture, Holmes said quietly, "There are three possibilities as to the note, Watson. The first, an elaborate hoax meant to disrupt diplomatic correspondence. The second, an internal betrayal. The third, an external agent of uncommon skill and daring, likely foreign. Each possibility disturbs me in equal measure." I nodded. "You suspect espionage, then?" "I suspect someone wishes us to believe in espionage," he said. "But there is too much theatre in the scene described: a cracked window, a missing attaché, a cryptic note. This is a display, Watson, not a mere message. The showmanship of it compels the observer to draw conclusions prematurely." Porton Terrace proved to be a narrow, elegant row of Georgian townhouses nestled within a quiet lane, barely 3 minutes' walk from the Houses of Parliament. Number 17, the property in question, was unassuming save for its shuttered windows and a single gas lamp still lit above the iron gate. A butler greeted us without word, bowing us in and silently gesturing toward the drawing-room. Sir Reginald Fanshawe, seated near the hearth, rose at our entrance. He was a tall, hawkish man with white whiskers and sunken cheeks, his suit immaculate and his manner brittle with tension. "Mr. Holmes, I appreciate your discretion," he said. "This room has not been touched since the incident. You will find everything as I left it at 8:30 last night." Holmes inclined his head. "You have my assurance, Sir Reginald, that nothing of this shall reach the press." "Nor Scotland Yard?" "Not unless necessity demands it." Sir Reginald's lips twitched, but he said no more. Holmes had already stepped past him and was pacing the room, taking in its dimensions with eyes that darted like the lens of a camera. The space was modest but refined. Walnut-panelled walls, a Turkish carpet, 2 armchairs facing the hearth, a small liquor cabinet near the bookcase. The fireplace was cold, but last night's coals remained undisturbed. The window in question stood at the far end, tall, double-hinged and flanked by heavy green drapes. Holmes approached it and gestured for me to follow. "Note the fracture, Watson." I leaned in. The crack bisected the centre pane diagonally, a splintered gash like a lightning bolt. It had not broken through completely, but its presence was unmistakable. And there, nestled along the lower edge, barely visible to the naked eye, was the faint impression of a small groove, just wide, enough to suggest something had once been lodged inside. Holmes ran a gloved finger across the crack, then turned sharply toward the desk at the room's side. It bore a blotter, 2 fountain pens, and a glass paperweight. From his coat, Holmes withdrew the envelope Beechcroft had given him earlier and held it beside the desk lamp, carefully prizing it open. It is, as you noted, singed at the edges, burned before being placed inside the window, or during its insertion. Watson frowned. "You suspect some device?" "I suspect something of surgical intent," Holmes murmured. He held the note up to the light. A string of irregular characters formed a single line, written in thick, dark ink. "Le hibou pleure à minuit, mais son cri n'est pour personne." I translated aloud. "The owl cries at midnight, but its call is for no one." Holmes smirked. Poetic, if unsubtle. Sir Reginald, who had stood silent till now, stepped forward. "We believe it to be a cipher. The owl cries at midnight. It may signal a meeting time, or a warning, but the second part, its call is for no one, may imply the message was intercepted or sabotaged." Holmes folded the note. "Was the attaché expected to bring any documents?" Sir Reginald stiffened. "No papers, merely a verbal account of recent political developments in Constantinople. His name was Armand Duchamp. He had ties to both French and Ottoman embassies, a delicate bridge." "Was he known for punctuality?" "To the letter," Sir Reginald replied. "Then the failure to appear cannot be ascribed to mere lateness. Mr. Duchamp may be unable to appear or unwilling. In either case, the note's presence suggests an intervention, a replacement message perhaps, or a warning meant for someone else." Holmes examined the window latch and lock. "This pane was manufactured by Holworth and Sons, I see. Reinforced glass, common in embassy windows, as Mr. Beechcroft stated, yet the crack implies an impact of focused force, more than one could achieve with a mere thrown pebble." Watson leaned over. "Could it have been fired, projected somehow?" "Perhaps," Holmes said thoughtfully. "But what intrigues me is the precision. The note did not tumble into the room. It was placed, inserted along the fracture, then left. That suggests a deliberate act by someone who did not enter." "And the angle?" I asked. Holmes moved to the street-facing side of the room and peered through the frosted glass. "Ah, note the wrought-iron balcony. It extends just below the window, likely used for watering plants in summer. If one had access to the adjacent house and was skilled in balance and intent—" He did not finish the thought, but stepped back, satisfaction glimmering in his eyes. Sir Reginald cleared his throat. "What course of action would you advise, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes turned to face him squarely. "I advise patience and vigilance. This message was not merely delivered, it was staged. There is another move coming, Sir Reginald. The piece on the board has shifted, but the player has not yet shown their face." Sir Reginald said nothing. Holmes reached for his coat. "We shall now pay a visit to the property next door." "The neighbour?" I asked, surprised. "Indeed, Watson, for if one cannot open a window from within, one must open a path from without. I suspect our phantom message-bearer did not vanish into fog, but left behind a trail. The trick is knowing where to look. We exited into the raw morning air, our breath fogging as we descended the front steps. Holmes glanced once up at the unbroken window above, then turned his steps deliberately toward number 15, its twin in architecture, but as we would soon learn, not in silence. The townhouse at number 15 Porton Terrace was a mirror image of Sir Reginald's dwelling, but there the resemblance ended. Where number 17 was immaculate and dignified, its neighbour bore an air of half-forgotten respectability, a brass knocker dulled by soot, a small crack in the marble step, a lace curtain in the parlour window tugged aside as though recently disturbed. Holmes paused before ascending, his eyes sweeping over the facade with the minute attention of a painter examining a forgery. He tilted his head. "Note, Watson, the ledge above the ground floor window, scuffed, slightly cleaner at the centre, recently used." "A cat?" I offered. Holmes smiled. "A cat with boots, perhaps." Before I could reply, he rang the bell. After a long pause and a second ring, the door creaked open. A woman, late middle age and rather worn by the years, peered out with suspicion. Her hair was tied in a loose bun, and her apron was streaked with flour. She smelled faintly of yeast and firewood. "Yes?" Holmes removed his hat and offered a slight bow. "Pardon the intrusion, madam. I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my associate, Dr. John Watson. We are investigating a matter of urgency involving your neighbour, number 17. Her expression changed, wariness shifting to irritation. "I've already told the other one I don't want any trouble in this house." "The other one?" "A gentleman, well dressed, asked after the same business this morning, said he was with the Metropolitan Police, had a little silver badge on his lapel, didn't seem like a constable to me." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "How long ago?" She squinted. "Oh, perhaps an hour before you. He left in a great rush, didn't say much, only poked about near the rear stairs." "May we come in and see the same area?" She hesitated. Holmes took a half-step back. "Only if it causes no distress to your household. But I believe this is not merely a matter of domestic inquiry. There may be danger involved." Her brow furrowed. "Very well, but don't blame me if you find naught but dust." She led us down a narrow hall, its floorboards creaking with every step, past a sitting room smelling faintly of coal ash and jam. At the rear we came to a small kitchen, tidy but modest, and a side door that opened to an enclosed alley behind the house. "There," she said, pointing to the back stairwell that wound up to the second-floor balcony. "He was up and down those stairs like a rat in a chimney." Holmes stepped out into the bracing air, scanning the iron railing and the wooden stair treads. He produced a small magnifying glass from his coat and crouched low. "Watson, observe. Scoring on the railing's edge, precisely where a gloved hand might grasp while balancing." I leaned over. There, almost invisible to the casual eye, were thin parallel scratches, marks made perhaps by a ring or a cuff-link scraping against paint. "The question, Watson," Holmes murmured, "is not whether someone climbed from this property to number 17's balcony, but how they managed it in under 4 minutes. Holmes climbed halfway up the stair and stopped beside the ornate wrought-iron planter affixed just below the level of the neighbouring window. He ran his fingers along the rim and nodded. Hollow, recently disturbed. He tapped it gently. A dull, metallic thud followed. "Watson, assist me." I joined him, and together we lifted the lid of the planter. Hidden inside, wrapped in oilskin, was a narrow brass tube, perhaps 12 inches long, with a fine slit at one end. Holmes held it up to the light. "A delivery instrument," he said with quiet satisfaction. Cleverly concealed, this was likely used to insert the note through the cracked glass. I stared at it. But how? That window is reinforced. Indeed, that is the brilliance of it. You recall the note's edges were burned. I suspect this device used an incendiary trigger, not to explode, but to force a pressure release that struck the window with a narrow bolt, not to shatter, but to fracture. A mechanical impact, combined with heat? Precisely. The crack was necessary, not a flaw, but the aperture. Once opened, this tube could have pushed the rolled note inside, a theatre of precision. Holmes examined the surrounding area, now to discover who placed it here. This device was not fashioned by an amateur. It required planning, equipment, access, and timing. The woman, who had remained just within the doorway, now called. "There was someone on the roof last night." Holmes spun. "Say again, madam." "I thought it was a chimney sweep just past 8. I heard movement, footsteps on the tiles above the parlour, but when I looked out, saw no ladder, no man." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You mentioned a visitor earlier this morning, the man claiming to be police. Did he give a name?" She shook her head. "No, foreign, I'd say. Polite, but something odd about his speech. Slippery." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, we must return to Baker Street. I require a directory of engineers who have worked with the Admiralty on reinforced glass installations, and a list of diplomatic envoys arriving from Constantinople in the past fortnight." I blinked. "You believe the attacker is connected to the embassy staff?" "I believe the man who sent the note is not the man who meant to receive it." As we exited the house, Holmes paused once more and glanced upward. The rooftops of Porton Terrace vanished into the grey, but his gaze remained fixed, as though divining a pattern in fog. Then he muttered, half to himself, "An owl cries at midnight, but its call is for no one," unless the owl was never meant to cry at all. We boarded a cab moments later, Holmes silent, until Baker Street rose into view. He leaned back and closed his eyes. "Someone is building a story within a story, Watson. A deception meant not to conceal the truth, but to plant a falsehood. And somewhere in that fracture of glass lies the true sequence." He opened his eyes again as we turned into our street. "I should like to test a theory. If I am wrong, we lose a morning. But if I am right, then the man on the roof was not alone." By the time we returned to Baker Street, the sleet had hardened into icy pellets, pelting against the windows like the tapping of impatient fingers. Mrs. Hudson had placed a pot of strong assam on the side table and lit the fire to its fullest, but Holmes ignored both comforts, striding immediately to the bookcase beside his chemical apparatus. He retrieved a thin grey ledger bound in twine, a directory I had seen him consult only on the most peculiar of cases. "Watson," he said, laying the volume upon the table with a decisive thud, "the glass used at Porton Terrace is of a specialized compound, used only in a handful of secure sites across London. This is not the domain of the local glazier. Only government-contracted fabricators would have access to such materials." He flipped rapidly through the pages, stopping on a column titled "Reinforced Architectural Installers, Government and Private Contract." There, Harold Spinks and Company, subcontractors for the Admiralty with extensions to the Foreign Office and the Treasury, based in Suffolk. I leaned in. "You believe someone from this firm provided the attacker access, or expertise? Or perhaps something even more insidious," Holmes murmured. "An insider with knowledge of the installation schedules, security modifications, or glass tolerances. To engineer a message through a fracture without triggering a full break, one must know the material intimately." Holmes jotted down the address and handed it to me. "Make inquiries, Watson. Present yourself as researching recent innovations in government security installations. Spinks may speak more freely to a curious doctor than to a known detective. And you? Holmes turned toward his writing desk, where a pile of recent Gazette clippings lay scattered. I shall pursue the second thread, our elusive Mr. Duchamp. The attaché who failed to appear may hold the key to this riddle, and I intend to learn whether he vanished or was vanished. By noon, I found myself inside the modest offices of Harold Spinks & Co., a low building nestled behind a larger warehouse smelling of turpentine and lime dust. The reception area was sparse, a single desk, 2 upright chairs, and a small wall calendar depicting a steamship with fluttering pennants. A balding clerk with pince-nez greeted me. "Yes, sir?" I adjusted my hat. "Dr. John Watson. I'm doing a bit of writing on modern security materials, particularly those adopted by government departments. Your firm's name came highly recommended." The man blinked, surprised, but then seemed pleased by the attention. "Ah, yes, we've supplied to several ministries, glassworks, door reinforcements, dampening chambers. Not all I'm allowed to talk about, of course." "Quite understandable," I said. "Though I am curious. Your reinforced glass, is it designed to fracture under pressure or to resist it entirely?" "Depends on the compound. Some are layered to absorb shock, others are rigged with brittle seams that fail predictably under stress to allow a quick replacement or message retrieval in emergencies." I raised a brow. "Message retrieval?" He waved his hand. "Oh, I speak too freely. Just theoretical. Part of training." I nodded slowly. "Have you had any recent commissions near Westminster?" He leaned in, voice lowering instinctively. "Number 17 Porton Terrace. That's one of ours." That confirmed it. "May I ask who supervised that installation?" He reached for a slim logbook and flipped through. "Let's see. That would be Mr. Alec Hartley, senior field engineer, oversees our sensitive fittings. He's out today, left for Devon on personal leave, but he should be back tomorrow." "Is he a man given to speaking of his work?" "Oh, no," the clerk assured. "Former military. Keeps things locked up tighter than a torpedo hatch." I thanked him for his time and departed, with Holmes's suspicion firmly underlined. Someone with knowledge of the glass was involved. Back at Baker Street, Holmes greeted me with unusual gravity. "Watson, you recall the French attaché Armand Duchamp?" "Of course." "He is dead." I stared at him. "What?" Holmes handed me the early evening edition of the Evening Chronicle. The headline read, "Man found drowned in Limehouse Basin. Identity confirmed as diplomatic courier." The article described a man discovered floating in the frozen shallows near the eastern docks, body badly bruised, pockets empty, hands bound loosely with a silk cord. Identification was confirmed via a Foreign Office badge found stitched into the inner lining of his coat. "He was discovered this morning," Holmes said. "But the body had not been there long, no more than 10 hours, the constable." "Estimates. That places the time of death late last night, precisely when he should have arrived at Porton Terrace." Holmes paced, eyes alight with the focused fire of deduction. Someone lured Duchamp to an alternate location, perhaps under pretense of moving the meeting. Then, after extracting what they needed or ensuring his silence, they disposed of him where he would eventually be found. But not immediately. The delay was calculated. The message in the cracked glass came after his death, not before. "To cover the crime?" "To continue the game," Holmes replied. "The message was never meant for Sir Reginald. It was theatre, a signal sent to a different observer entirely." A silence fell between us, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Then Holmes said, "There is more. The woman at number 15 mentioned a visitor, a supposed detective. I visited Scotland Yard. No inspector was dispatched to Porton Terrace this morning." "An impostor?" "Wearing a silver badge, described as foreign, articulate, and polished." "Then who was he?" "That," Holmes said with a slow smile, is what we must next determine. There is a player in this game who does not fear exposure, only misinterpretation. They've already been inside one house and likely atop another. They move with precision, not panic. He turned to the window and looked out toward the swirling fog. Tonight, Watson, we return to Porton Terrace. There is something about the cracked window, its angle, its depth, that nags at me. I wish to see it under gaslight. And the engineer, Hartley? We shall call upon him in the morning. Holmes smiled faintly as he lit his pipe. But tonight we revisit the glass that would not break in search of the message it was never meant to carry. We arrived at Porton Terrace shortly after 8:30, escorted once more through number 17's narrow vestibule by the same butler who now wore the strained expression of a man disturbed too often in one day. Holmes thanked him with a slight nod and requested that the gas sconces in the drawing-room be dimmed. "Just enough light to see," he said, "but no more." The man obeyed, withdrawing without a word. Holmes waited until the latch clicked behind him before stepping to the centre of the room, where the hearth stood cold and shadowed. Only the crackling lamplight from the corridor filtered in, painting faint lines across the carpet and glinting on the edge of the window pane. Holmes approached the fractured glass with silent reverence. I remained just behind him, notebook in hand, more out of habit than purpose. The crack itself was unchanged, a lightning bolt frozen mid-strike, but under the dim gaslight its contours seemed different, deeper, cleaner. Holmes knelt before the window and withdrew a small lens and a folding ruler from his coat. "You recall, Watson," he murmured, "the precision of the fracture. A controlled strike, but observe, at the apex of the crack there is no chipping, no splintering outward. The force was not blunt, it was narrow, directed, almost surgical." He moved the lens slowly along the length of the fracture. "And look here. A residue." I peered closer. A faint smear ran along the inner edge of the crack, nearly invisible except where the light hit at a precise angle. It shimmered faintly, oily, almost metallic. "Chemical?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Likely a trace of potassium dichromate or similar reagent used to stress crystalline structures. Whoever placed the note did not merely exploit an existing flaw, they made the flaw, then inserted the message with exacting control." I looked around the room, chilled now, not by the air, but by the thought that such silent craftsmanship had occurred just steps from where the permanent secretary had waited, oblivious. Holmes rose and turned to the writing desk. He scanned its contents again, inkwell, pens, blotter, and then lifted the paperweight. Beneath it, where the blotter had shielded the surface, a perfect circle of dust-free wood gleamed. "Watson," he said, "imagine a man is expecting a confidential visitor. He sets the room meticulously. 2 chairs, 2 glasses, the decanter left untouched. He steps away for 4 minutes. When he returns, his guest has not arrived, but the window is cracked and a message has appeared." "Yes," I said. "But now imagine something else. The visitor had arrived, just not in the manner expected." I stared at him. "You believe the messenger entered the room?" "No, but I believe they observed it, perhaps even influenced it, without ever stepping inside. The timing, the placement of the message, the fact that it was impossible. These are not flaws in the plan, Watson. They are the plan." I was still puzzling over his meaning when he moved swiftly to the fireplace. Above it hung a mirror, framed in gilt and streaked faintly with soot. Holmes turned it slightly upon its hinge, and suddenly the entire room shifted in reflection. I saw the doorway, the decanter, the 2 chairs, and the window with its hairline crack, glinting precisely at eye level. Holmes smiled. "There, now consider if you stood on the balcony of number 15, and peered in through the window at this angle, what would you see? The whole room, I breathed. Indeed. You'd see Sir Reginald enter, check the chairs, pour the drinks. And then, when he stepped into the corridor, you'd act, a quick strike, chemical or mechanical, followed by the insertion of the note through the still warm fracture. 4 minutes, no more. But why go to such lengths, I asked. Why not simply deliver the message another way? Holmes's smile faded. Because the message was not for Sir Reginald. It was for the man on the outside, the false detective, the one who came after. You mean? Yes, he said. This room was the stage. Sir Reginald was the audience, but the actor was watching from a distance, ensuring the performance played out exactly as intended. The cracked glass, the placement of the note, the absence of Duchamp, it's all narrative. Someone is telling a story, Watson, and they are using this room as their theatre. He returned to the window and tapped lightly along the sill. Then he crouched again, drawing a small envelope from his coat pocket. Inside it was a scrap of thick brown paper. He pressed it gently into the residue along the fracture. A lift, he explained. To collect the chemical trace, I shall analyze it later. I felt the weight of the silence around us deepen. Outside, the wind moaned against the building. Somewhere down the terrace, a door slammed. Holmes straightened. There is one final matter. He moved to the sideboard and removed the decanter's stopper. He sniffed, then dipped a finger and tasted. Whiskey, he said. Unadulterated. Now the glasses. He sniffed the first, then the second. The first was clean. The second... Ah, he murmured. Traces of lemon. A fingerprint here. Partial, smudged, but recently made. Our visitor never touched the door, the chairs, or the hearth, but he touched this glass, perhaps in error, perhaps intentionally. I stepped forward. To leave a signature? Or a false lead, Holmes said. But either way he was here, not inside the room, but close enough to reach through the moment the stage was empty. We turned as the butler returned quietly. Sir Reginald has retired for the evening, gentlemen. Shall I see you out? Holmes nodded absently, still staring at the fractured glass. Yes, we are done here, for now. Outside, as we stepped again into the sleet and soot of Porton Terrace, Holmes paused at the iron rail separating number 17 from its twin. He looked up at the roof lines once more, lips pursed. Watson, tomorrow we speak with Alec Hartley, the engineer, but tonight I believe the theatre has one final act to show us. He pulled his collar up against the wind and began walking toward the alley behind the houses, the narrow passageway we had first seen from number 15's kitchen. Where are we going now? I asked. To search for an audience, Watson, Holmes replied without turning. For a performance so precise as this cannot exist without someone to applaud it. The fog thickened as we rounded the corner to the rear of Porton Terrace. Holmes led us along a narrow passage that cleaved between the terrace's garden walls and the soot-darkened backs of neighbouring buildings. Gaslight barely reached this part of Westminster, and the alley was a corridor of dripping eaves, shuttered windows, and the occasional flicker of movement in the periphery. It was here, away from the orderly facades of diplomacy, that London whispered its secrets. Holmes walked ahead in silence, his boots muffled against the damp stone. At number 15's back gate, he paused, withdrawing a slender coil of wire from his pocket. "Locked," he murmured, testing the latch. As I expected, he crouched, worked for less than a minute, and the gate clicked open with a whisper. "Come, Watson." I followed him into the yard where the same narrow staircase rose toward the upper balcony we had seen earlier. Holmes did not climb it. Instead, he turned to a wooden trellis mounted on the side wall, weather-worn but sturdy enough, and began to ascend toward the sloped roof above the kitchen. "Surely not," I said beneath my breath. But he was already halfway up, his coat clinging like a shadow as he moved with the agility of a younger man. I had no choice but to follow, and soon we found ourselves crouched upon the slates of number 15, London's fog billowing around us like the folds of an unmade stage curtain. Holmes crouched low and motioned to the edge of the rooftop. "Here," he said quietly, pointing. A set of impressions, barely visible in the dew, led from the trellis to the ridge of the roof. The slates were disturbed in small crescents, not bootprints exactly, but marks left by someone crawling or crouching low. "Not a full ascent," Holmes whispered. He came up just far enough to observe. Perhaps he returned after the message was delivered. Why? To watch Sir Reginald, to confirm the scene had been set as intended. No actor completes a performance without ensuring the applause. I peered into the fog. From here, the cracked window of number 17 was clearly visible, its fractured pane catching what little light escaped the gas sconces below. The mirror above the fireplace, I realized, could reflect the room like a lantern, visible from this very roof, if one knew where to stand. "Holmes," I said, my voice low, "this man, the one who climbed up here, he had to know the room's exact layout. The mirror, the chairs, the timing. He wasn't improvising. This was calculated." Holmes nodded. "Exactly, Watson, which leads us to a critical deduction." He moved across the roof on all fours, scanning carefully near a chimney stack. Then he stopped. "Watson, here?" I joined him. In the shallow groove between two chimney bricks lay a small object, no larger than a button. Holmes extracted it delicately with tweezers and held it to the moonlight. A matte black coin embossed with an unfamiliar crest, a six-pointed star surrounded by geometric patterns. Foreign, certainly, not English coinage. "What do you make of it?" I asked. Holmes studied the crest, then drew a breath. "I have seen this symbol before, not in coinage, but on stationery, seals, diplomatic credentials." He paused. "It belongs to the Imperial Mission of Austro-Hungarian Affairs in Constantinople." A fresh chill passed through me, deeper than the winter air. "You believe the man on the roof is an envoy?" Holmes turned the coin in his fingers. "No, Watson, I believe he is not an envoy. I believe he is someone posing as one, using their credentials to infiltrate meetings, misdirect officials, and eliminate those who become inconvenient." Duchamp. Precisely. His death was no mischance. He was removed to prevent contradiction. The impostor could not risk a genuine envoy arriving and ruining the illusion. I stared at the coin. Then the man who visited number 15, posing as police, was the same man who climbed this roof, Holmes said, and the same man who cracked the window and placed the note. He is not merely a messenger, he is the author. "But what is he saying with all this?" I asked. "What does the message mean?" Holmes pocketed the coin. "We are not yet ready for the full translation, Watson, but we now know who the actor is pretending to be. Tomorrow, we determine who he really is." We returned to Baker Street in the early hours, cold to the bone but invigorated by progress. Holmes allowed himself a single brandy and a short spell of violin before we both retired. The melody was slow and solemn, echoing through the flat like the turning pages of an unfinished story. The next morning brought a terse note delivered by hand. "From the desk of Lionel Beechcroft. Urgent. Please come to the Foreign Office at once. Confidential incident involving Alec Hartley." Holmes read the note once and rose without a word. 10 minutes later, we were in a cab careening toward Whitehall. We were shown in without delay, led through 2 corridors and into a private room where Beechcroft stood at a window, hands behind his back. He turned sharply when we entered. "Hartley has vanished," he said. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "When?" "Sometime during the night. He boarded a train from Devon yesterday evening, as scheduled. Was meant to arrive in London before midnight. He never checked in. His compartment was found empty, save for a scrap of torn paper bearing your name, Mr. Holmes." Beechcroft handed over the fragment. Holmes studied it. "From a notebook," he said, "ripped hastily, smudged with ash." He looked at Beechcroft. "No sign of struggle?" "None, but the conductor recalls a second man seen speaking with Hartley during the journey. Foreign, well-dressed." Holmes turned to me slowly. "It is him again. He has removed the engineer, which means that Hartley knew something," I finished. "Something dangerous. Or," Holmes said, "something the impostor could not risk him telling us." Beechcroft stepped forward. "What do you require, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes's answer was instant. "Access to all diplomatic arrivals from Constantinople in the past month. I want names, aliases, handlers, and rooms registered under consular protection, and a list of former embassy staff dismissed for cause within the last 2 years. Beechcroft's brows rose. "That's highly restricted." Holmes gave a thin smile. "So is death by diplomatic silence, Mr. Beechcroft, and we already have 2 bodies. Beechcroft swallowed, then nodded. "Very well. You'll have the files by nightfall." As we exited, Holmes's jaw tightened. "The play is accelerating, Watson, and I fear Act 3 may close with another disappearance, unless we intervene." I said nothing, but I felt it too. The story had shifted once more, and the glass that wouldn't break was not the puzzle. It was the mirror. Holmes did not speak for the duration of our return journey from Whitehall. He sat with gloved fingers steepled beneath his chin, his brow furrowed in deep abstraction, eyes unfocused and half-lidded, as though staring into the tangle of invisible threads that now connected the cracked window, a drowned attaché, a vanished engineer, and an impostor who left only false credentials and a foreign coin in his wake. It was only as our hansom turned onto Baker Street that he stirred. "We must not chase the man, Watson," he said abruptly, as if continuing a conversation we had never started. "That is his game, to lead us from absence to absence, always one station behind. What we must do is force him to chase us." Inside the flat, Holmes moved swiftly, spreading Beechcroft's promised file upon the table. As he had requested, the Foreign Office had delivered 2 sealed folders by confidential courier, one containing diplomatic arrivals from Constantinople over the past month, and the second listing all known disavowed or disgraced members of foreign consular staff within the last 2 years. I leaned over his shoulder as he opened the first. "Here," Holmes said, tapping the topmost sheet. "Arrivals via Calais and Dover, 5 consular dignitaries from the Ottoman mission, 2 with Austro-Hungarian clearance, and this—" He paused, finger resting on a 3rd name. "Milos Reiter, former attaché to the Austro-Hungarian mission, discharged 1893, status unknown." "Why does that name concern you?" I asked. Holmes held up the black coin we had retrieved from the rooftop. "Because the symbol etched here matches the seal used in correspondence from Reiter's office before his dismissal. I examined such a letter years ago during a case involving smuggled passports through Trieste. Reiter was accused of forging diplomatic credentials for clandestine agents." He rifled through the second folder. "And look, his name appears again, discharged after an investigation into missing documents from the Ottoman legation. The inquiry was buried, naturally. No charges, no further sightings." I read aloud from the document. "Reported as withdrawing voluntarily from service due to health." Holmes scoffed. Diplomatic phrasing for a man shuffled out before scandal could take root. I frowned. "So you believe this impostor, our rooftop ghost, is Milos Reiter?" "I believe he is using writer's name or pieces of his past, to move unchallenged. What intrigues me, Watson, is not writer's dismissal, but his vanishing. There is no trace of his departure from London, no death certificate, no travel record. It's as though he dissolved. Holmes stood and began pacing. Duchamp was silenced because he was expected, Hartley because he understood the mechanics of the glass, but both men were inconvenient because they could verify or refute details in a story being carefully constructed. The cracked window, I murmured. The note? The choreography? Exactly. And the coin left behind was not a clue, but a signature, one meant to guide us to writer's shadow. But here is the question, Watson. Would a man so careful, so surgical, so invisible, really be so foolish as to leave behind an identifying token? I blinked. A false trail? Holmes smiled, but there was no mirth in it. He wants us to believe we've found him. He wants us to look backward. Meanwhile, the real performance continues ahead. A knock interrupted our thoughts. Mrs. Hudson appeared with an envelope, her expression creased with concern. This just arrived by boy, Mr. Holmes. No return address, but he said it was urgent. The boy, I mean, not the envelope. Holmes took it and examined the seal. Plain wax, unremarkable paper. He slit it open. Inside was a single slip. In crisp ink, the following was written: Sir Reginald drinks from the right-hand glass, but he will not see the poison in time. No signature, no salutation. Only that chilling message. We stared at it in silence. Then Holmes sprang into motion. To the Foreign Office, immediately! We arrived in less than 15 minutes, thanks to Holmes securing a cab with an urgency that brooked no argument. Upon our arrival, we were led not to Sir Reginald's formal office, but to a private meeting room behind the north wing, where he had been relocated for reasons of security. Beechcroft met us at the door, his expression grave. He's been ill since breakfast, he said. Complained of dizziness, blurred vision, and fatigue. The physician suspects stress or indigestion. Holmes brushed past him and entered the room. Sir Reginald sat upright in a high-backed chair, his skin ashen and a slight tremor in his fingers. A physician stood nearby, closing a medical bag. It's likely nothing serious, the man was saying, though I've drawn blood for testing. Holmes stepped to the desk, where 2 glasses rested, one nearly full, the other drained to its base. Holmes picked up the fuller one. This was yours? Sir Reginald nodded weakly. Holmes sniffed it, then handed it to me. Citrus. Lemon added to mask bitterness. I took a sip, cautiously, then spat it into my handkerchief. The aftertaste was unmistakable, chalky, chemical, wrong. Holmes turned to Beechcroft. Secure both glasses. Lock the room. Sir Reginald must be kept under observation, and the remainder of his recent meals examined. Beechcroft paled but obeyed. Watson, Holmes said, you will accompany the physician. Ensure the blood analysis includes atropine derivatives, particularly hyoscine or datura, a mild dose, designed not to kill but to mimic illness. To remove him from action, I said. To make room for the next move, Holmes confirmed. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes sat once more with the anonymous message before him. He knows our every step, Watson. He's within our walls. He tapped the message. This was not a warning, it was a taunt. I leaned forward. Then what's his next move? Holmes stared into the fire, his voice soft but clear. He will come for the message itself. The cracked glass was the first act. Sir Reginald's fall the second. The third will be to retrieve or erase whatever remains of the original cipher. I frowned. But the note has already been handed over. Yes, Holmes said, but the scene remains. The room, the placement, the mirror. There is still a piece left to play, and I intend to be there when our impostor returns to reclaim it." He stood, his shadow long against the firelight. "Tomorrow night, Watson, we bait the trap." The night air that settled over Porton Terrace was thick and unnervingly still, as if London itself were holding its breath. Fog crept low along the paving stones, and the faint glow of gas lamps smeared into the mist like pale brushstrokes. Holmes and I arrived at number 17 shortly after 10:30, dressed not in our usual coats but in dull workingmen's attire, our faces smudged with soot and our boots scuffed deliberately. "Subtlety," Holmes had said on the way over, "is the greater form of misdirection. If we arrive as ourselves, we announce a play, but if we vanish into the walls, the actor will continue unimpeded." The butler had been dismissed early under the pretext of an early morning maintenance inspection. Sir Reginald, still recovering under observation, had no intention of returning that evening, and Beechcroft had arranged for a discreet watch to be kept on his residence. For the moment, number 17 belonged to us, and to whomever might come seeking the past. Inside the drawing-room, the cracked window loomed large and silent in the pale wash of the moonlight. Holmes immediately extinguished all but one gas sconce in the corridor, allowing only a whisper of illumination to enter the room. Then he turned his attention to the scene. "It must be perfect," he murmured. "Every chair, every shadow, must echo the performance as it first played." I watched as he reset the decanter and the two glasses, one full, one nearly empty, upon the sideboard. The mirror above the hearth was polished just enough to catch the angle of the window once more. Even the paperweight was returned to its exact position on the blotter. Nothing was left to chance. Finally, Holmes turned to me. "You will hide in the service cupboard just beyond the corridor arch," he said. "The keyhole gives you clear view of the sitting room. If he enters, do not move. I shall be in the space behind the wainscot panel to the left of the fireplace. I carved the latch myself this afternoon." "You believe he'll return tonight?" I asked. "I believe," Holmes replied softly, "that he has already chosen this night." The removal of Sir Reginald was timed precisely. Tonight is the only window in which the scene can be tampered with before the Foreign Office regains control. We took our positions without further exchange. The cupboard was cramped, thick with old polish and soapstone, and I was conscious of every creak beneath my boots as I settled in. The air was thin and cold. Through the keyhole I could see the dim line of moonlight fall across the centre of the drawing-room rug, dividing the scene as if it were a stage awaiting its final act. And then we waited. Time stretched long and taut. From my concealed vantage I could hear nothing beyond the faint creaks of the house settling and the occasional scratch of Holmes shifting his weight behind the panel. The tension played upon my nerves like taut violin strings. At one point, a gust of wind rattled the window, and I started involuntarily, pressing my ear closer to the wood. Then, some time past midnight, movement. A faint click. Not the front door. No, it came from above, the sound of weight on the roof. Then a softer noise, a sliding panel, perhaps a sash window, being eased open. I held my breath. Holmes had been right. A shadow passed across the hallway wall, silent, deliberate. Then the figure entered the drawing-room. Through the keyhole, I could see him only in fragments. First, a boot crossing the rug, then a gloved hand reaching toward the decanter. He wore a dark overcoat, tight-fitting gloves, and a soft-brimmed hat pulled low. His movements were precise, no hesitation. He did not inspect the room, he did not search. He moved directly to the mirror above the hearth and tilted it slowly, no more than an inch. Then he stepped to the cracked window and ran a slender tool along the fracture. Not to damage it further, but to remove something from within. My pulse quickened. The message? No, it was already gone. Instead, he retrieved something that had been lodged deep within the lower frame. He turned it in his fingers, too small for me to see clearly, and pocketed it. Then, with one swift motion, he pulled a small vial from his coat and uncorked it, dabbing its contents along the mirror's edge. Holmes had said the mirror was the final piece. This man was erasing it. The acid hissed faintly. The silvery backing dulled. A fingerprint? A hidden inscription? Whatever had been imprinted on the mirror's surface, it was now being destroyed. The man turned back toward the door, but Holmes was already there. "Not so quickly," came the voice from the shadows. The intruder spun. For the first time I saw his face clearly. A gaunt man, perhaps 40, with sharp cheekbones, a narrow nose and eyes that glinted with intelligence. His skin bore the pallor of someone who had not spent much time in the sun, and his expression was composed, almost amused. "I should have guessed you'd be waiting," he said quietly. His voice was smooth, with the trace of an Eastern European accent. "You play the hound well, Mr. Holmes." "I prefer the term observer," Holmes replied, stepping fully into the moonlight. "Though you flatter me, Mr. Writer, if that is what you're calling yourself this week." The man gave a dry laugh. "You know that name's a ghost." "And yet you wear its skin." "I borrow what's useful," the man said, glancing toward the shattered mirror, "and discard the rest." "I'd advise you not to move," Holmes said evenly. "Watson has a revolver, trained on the archway." That was not strictly true. I did have my revolver, but I hadn't moved an inch. Still, the impostor paused, weighing his odds. Then he said, "You're too late, you know." "Am I?" "The mirror is gone. The message, the signature. It's all ash now. Your theatre is empty. The audience has left." Holmes tilted his head. "Then why are you still here?" Writer's smile twitched. For the first time, I saw something beneath the surface, an urgency, a flicker of calculation, gone awry. "You're bluffing," he said. Holmes took a step forward. "Am I? You've played this beautifully. A fractured window, a cipher, a poisoned diplomat, a vanished engineer. But you miscalculated. You assumed the message would not be copied." Rita's eyes narrowed. Holmes continued, "You assumed Sir Reginald would keep it secret, but I kept the original. What you retrieved from the frame was a decoy, and your final act, this attempt to erase the trail, only confirms its significance." Writer said nothing. Holmes gave a sharp whistle. Within moments, a second figure emerged from the rear entrance. Beechcroft, flanked by a constable in plainclothes, stepped into the drawing room. "Take him," Holmes said. Rayter did not resist. As the constable bound his wrists, he looked directly at Holmes. "This doesn't end with me." "No," Holmes replied, "but it starts with you, and for now that will suffice." Later, as dawn crept over the rooftops and the fog began to lift, Holmes and I stood once more before the cracked window. "What was he trying to erase?" I asked. Holmes gestured toward the mirror, now dulled and streaked with acid. "There was a second cipher, Watson. A reflection embedded in the angle of the silvering. A fragment of the original message, only visible from the roof, and only if you knew where to look." "And he feared someone else might find it?" "He feared someone already had." I shook my head. "This entire affair, it was less a crime than a stage." Holmes smiled faintly. "Indeed, but sometimes, Watson, the curtain must rise before the truth can be seen." By the following morning, London had shrugged off the veil of fog that had hung low for days, and the early light that filtered through Baker Street's windows held the crispness of a city momentarily cleansed. The night's events, writer's capture, the thwarted erasure of the cipher, the silent performance staged in the drawing room of number 17 had left a weighty silence in their wake. Holmes, however, seemed only more invigorated. When I descended to our sitting room shortly after 8, I found him already at the chemical bench, sleeves rolled, eyes narrowed over a glass slide that he shifted carefully beneath the lens of his microscope. "You slept through the dawn, Watson," he said without looking up. "Forgive me for valuing mortal rest," I said. "Not all of us recharge by mental combustion." Holmes allowed the faintest grin to pass across his lips. "Your sarcasm improves with fatigue. Pour yourself some coffee. Mrs. Hudson has kindly anticipated your condition." I did so, and seated myself opposite him, watching the small pile of items spread across the table. Among them was the original note retrieved from the fractured glass, a thin square of mirrored glass from the shattered fireplace mirror, and the black diplomatic coin writer had so carelessly dropped on the rooftop. "I assume," I said, "that last night's theatre was not merely to draw him out, but also to test something." Holmes tapped the microscope base. "It was necessary to confirm what I suspected from the moment I saw the mirror's placement. Rita, or whoever he truly is, did not simply use the room as a message drop, he used it as an optical cipher." I sat up straighter. "The reflection?" "More than that," Holmes replied. "The mirror was designed to reflect the room at a precise angle, allowing anyone stationed on the adjacent rooftop to observe not only Sir Reginald's movements, but the positioning of the message in the window. However, there was something else. Look here." He slid a sheet of tracing paper across the table. On it, faint lines had been marked with charcoal, forming an angular pattern that at first seemed nothing more than broken geometry. But after a moment I saw it, repetition, alignment, a pattern that hinted at meaning beneath chaos. "This," Holmes said, "is what was embedded behind the mirror's silver backing, an inscription etched in copper with microscopic precision. I revealed it using a reagent and transferred it before the acid writer, applied, destroyed the surface." "A hidden message?" Holmes nodded. "But not text, coordinates, a sequence of longitude and latitude cleverly fragmented across mirrored planes. I've cross-referenced them this morning. Our mysterious cipher points not to Constantinople, nor Vienna, nor even Paris." "Then where?" Holmes turned the paper toward me and underlined the final coordinate set. "Bristol, Redcliffe Docks." I blinked. "Bristol? That's entirely off the trail." "Precisely why it was chosen," Holmes said. "While all eyes were turned eastward to foreign agents and political intrigue, our phantom directed attention far from the true drop point. The cracked window, the embassy coin, the false identity of writer, all were elements of misdirection. But this," he tapped the paper, "is the real play. Something waits at Redcliffe, something Duchamp knew, something writer was desperate to conceal." He rose and fetched his overcoat. "We leave within the hour. There's a mid-morning train from Paddington that will put us in Bristol before 2. I blinked. "You think there's still something to be found?" "I don't think, Watson. I know." The journey to Bristol passed in a blur. Holmes sat silent for most of it, occasionally sketching symbols into the margins of his notebook, then crossing them out in quick succession. I watched the frost-touched fields slide by beyond the window, wondering how many layers this mystery could possibly contain. We arrived at Redcliffe just after the fog began to roll in again from the Avon. The docks were half empty, bristling with cranes and idle barges. Pigeons flitted through rusted scaffolds, and the air smelled of salt, coal smoke, and fish left too long in the open air. Holmes led the way without hesitation, striding along the quay toward a set of disused warehouses, brick structures marked for demolition, their windows boarded and signs long faded. "Warehouse 4B, Holmes said, reading from the cipher sheet. It matches the final coordinate. We approached the padlocked door. Holmes knelt and examined the latch. Recently replaced, he murmured. Not factory issue. And look, scrapes along the bolt. Someone's opened and closed this many times with a key not meant for it. He stood and turned to me. Watson, your service revolver, if you please. I handed it over. He raised it, fired once at the lock, an echoing crack that startled nearby gulls into flight, and kicked the door open. Inside was a vast, cold expanse of dust and forgotten crates. Shafts of daylight poured through cracks in the boards, casting long stripes across the debris. We stepped cautiously, Holmes sweeping his lantern across the room. Near the back, behind a stack of rusted barrels, we found it. A crate, no markings, no shipping stencils, just a rough pine box nailed shut. Holmes took a crowbar from a nearby crate and pried it open. The lid gave with a groan of splinters. Inside, carefully nestled in straw, were 5 oilskin-wrapped packets. Holmes unwrapped one slowly. Inside were documents, dozens of them, official letters, embassy reports, blueprints stamped with military crests, dozens of seals, some Ottoman, some British, some French. Duchamp's archive, Holmes whispered. The real reason for the performance. These are the secrets he was meant to deliver before he was intercepted. I stared at the trove. But why Bristol? Because it's nowhere near where anyone would think to look, Holmes said. The mirror message, meant for a contact who never arrived. Writer was retrieving this cache, or ensuring its destruction before another could reach it. A noise behind us made us both spin. The door creaked again, this time closing. Footsteps. Holmes reached for the revolver, but no one came through, just silence. Then a voice, echoing through the gloom. You shouldn't have come. It was the same voice from the drawing room. Calm, unhurried, but this time no amusement, only resolve. Holmes stepped forward. You'll find, sir, he said into the dark, that I rarely obey advice. A shape emerged, a man in a dark overcoat, face shrouded beneath the brim of a trilby. Not Writer. Someone younger with similar eyes, cold, sharp, calculating. A successor. Holmes raised the pistol. Hands where I can see them. The man smiled faintly. I never bring weapons to graveyards. And then he ran. Not out the door, but deeper, vanishing into the catacombs of the dock's storage tunnels. Holmes turned to me. We're not done, Watson. The stage is bigger than we thought. The man had already vanished into the labyrinthine darkness before Holmes or I could make another move. The echo of his boots on the stone floor faded rapidly, swallowed by the damp air and the endless tangle of underground passages that threaded beneath Redcliffe docks. Holmes handed me the revolver without a word, then pulled a lantern from the crate and lit it with swift precision. Come, Watson, he said, already in motion. We may yet catch the director of this performance before he vanishes into the wings. We pursued him through a narrow corridor at the back of the warehouse, past rusting pipes and soot-darkened walls. The passage sloped downward and curved sharply, revealing a forgotten service tunnel. Stone-lined and musty, with iron reinforcement beams overhead and the trickle of water along the edges. It had once been part of the drainage system for the dry docks, long since sealed above, but still open below, where the secrets of Redcliffe had evidently taken root. Holmes moved swiftly, his lantern held low. He came not to retrieve the archive, Watson, but to guard it, to prevent its retrieval. This theatre we've walked into has yet another curtain, and our player now runs to protect the final act. We followed the trail of damp footprints, fresh in the silt, coating the tunnel floor. They veered left into a side shaft, then abruptly ceased at a wall of stacked crates and timber beams. Blocked? I asked. Holmes shook his head, eyes scanning the structure. No, concealed. He shifted one of the crates, revealing a hollow behind. A narrow crawl space, just large enough for a man to slip through. We followed, crawling on hands and knees for several feet until the passage opened again into a chamber, round, low-ceilinged, and lined with arched alcoves. The air here was different, older, heavier, and strangely still. Then we heard him. A single voice, speaking softly, not to us, but to himself, or perhaps to someone who wasn't there. Always another game, another piece. We write it in glass, in fire, in silence. Holmes raised a hand for quiet and edged forward. At the center of the chamber stood the man we'd glimpsed in the warehouse, a shadow in a long coat turned away from us. Before him was a pedestal of some kind, an old cargo lift that had long since rusted into stillness. Upon it sat a small metal case, padlocked, with a folded paper resting atop it. Holmes stepped into the light. "You've run far enough." The man turned slowly, revealing a face neither young nor old, but striking in its severity. His eyes, pale grey, were unfathomably calm. He regarded Holmes not with surprise, but with something like curiosity. "I wondered if you would follow," he said, his accent faint but unplaceable. "Even the great detective is bound by the thread of narrative." Holmes approached, cautious but firm. "If this is a story, sir, then you've mistaken your genre. The spy novel requires resolution, and I intend to write it with ink and iron." A flicker of a smile. "You see only half the tale. Writer was a ghost. I was the silence behind him, and before me there was another. We are not men. We are methods." Holmes's voice dropped. "You poisoned a diplomat, you murdered an engineer, you staged a false cipher behind diplomatic mirrors and planted a trap for every step we took." "And still you came," the man said. "That is what mattered." I stepped closer, revolver in hand. "What's in the case?" He looked at it, but did not reach for it. "The original cipher, not the fragments you recovered. The full message, translated, decrypted, prepared for delivery." "Delivery to whom?" Holmes demanded. He tilted his head. "To whomever reaches it first." Holmes stepped forward. "Then I'll be taking it now." But the man stepped back onto the lift platform. "Consider this, Mr. Holmes," he said, softly. "Every code begins as a message, but in the wrong hands it becomes a weapon." Holmes stiffened. "You'd destroy it?" "I would return it to silence." And with that, he pulled a hidden lever on the floor. There was a shriek of metal, and the platform beneath him jolted, descending rapidly into darkness. Holmes lunged, but the gap widened too fast. "Blast!" he hissed, peering over the edge. The shaft was deep, far deeper than it had any right to be. A service well from a much older structure, perhaps, built long before the modern docks. We heard the distant clang of metal striking base, then silence. Holmes turned to me. "We'll find another access point. That shaft must connect with the river tunnels." We retraced our steps, back through the crawl space, through the drainage tunnel, and into the open air of the docks. The mist had returned, this time heavier, clinging to our coats and lashes as we circled the warehouse block, seeking the grates and tunnels that might lead beneath. At last, behind a stack of iron scrap near the waterline, we found it, a corroded hatch, partially obscured by years of rubbish. Holmes pried it open, and we descended once more, this time into the lowest bowels of Redcliffe. The smell of brine and oil grew thicker. We followed the passage until we reached the bottom of the shaft. But he was gone. The lift lay still, the case gone. No footprints, no sign of exit. Just the echo of dripping water and the faintest hint of lemon on the air. Holmes crouched beside a puddle near the lift. "He left something." He held up a torn scrap of paper, soaked at one edge. On it were 5 words, written in the same hand as the first anonymous message. "The glass never breaks twice." We stared at it in silence. Then Holmes stood. "He's telling us he won't repeat his mistake," he said. "The cipher is lost or moved, and our ghost has vanished again." I looked around the tunnel. "So we're back to shadows?" Holmes's face hardened. "No. We've seen his method now. The theatre, the deception, the use of reflection and silence. He cannot change that. He believes in misdirection, but that means somewhere. The truth still waits." I stepped beside him. "Then what's our next move?" Holmes turned back toward the light above. "We begin again, but this time we write the script." The air in Baker Street was noticeably heavier that evening, a strange hush having settled over the parlour like a second fog. Outside, the city remained as it ever was, horse-drawn carriages clattering past, lamplighters completing their rounds and the rhythm of London pulsing beneath the winter gloom. But within our flat the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Holmes stood at the window motionless. The blinds were drawn only halfway, allowing the golden haze of the street lamp to silhouette his figure in broken angles. He had not spoken in over an hour. Across from him on the desk lay our only remaining link to the vanished cipher, the torn scrap of paper bearing the words, "The glass never breaks twice." I had read it again and again, seeking some second meaning, some code between the lines. But it remained elusive, like everything else our adversary had left in his wake. "Holmes," I said gently, "we must accept the possibility that the cipher is truly lost, that he has destroyed it just as he tried to erase the mirror." Holmes turned slightly, his expression unreadable. "Watson, when a man like that says a cipher is beyond recovery, one must ask, why say it at all?" I set down my cup. "Because he enjoys the performance." "Indeed, but consider this. If the cipher were truly obliterated, he would disappear into the ether without a word. He would not leave riddles. He would not taunt." I frowned. "Then you believe the message survives?" "I believe," Holmes said slowly, "that the cipher still exists, hidden in such a way that only one who understands the narrative can uncover it." He turned back to the desk and drew a piece of vellum across the blotter. With a soft graphite pencil, he began sketching a diagram of the room at number 17. The cracked window, the mirror, the fireplace, the twin chairs. Then he overlaid a second diagram, the rooftop, the balcony, the planter, and finally, number 15. "Let us revisit the scene, Watson, not in flesh, but in form." He drew an arrow from the mirror to the window. We assumed the cipher's message was visual, embedded in reflection or geometry. But what if the cipher was mechanical? I leaned in. "Mechanical?" Holmes nodded. "Duchamp was a courier, a man of routines, yes, but also a creature of caution. If he suspected interception, he would never deliver a message in a single medium." "You believe the cipher had a twin?" Holmes tapped the drawing. "He left one fragment at Porton Terrace, in the fracture, another in the mirror's silver backing. But what if the true cipher lay in neither?" I stared at the diagram. "You think he placed something in number 15? "More than placed, installed." Holmes stood abruptly and strode to the bookshelf. From a lower shelf, he extracted a slim monograph titled Foreign Cryptographic Devices, Volume 2. Within its pages were diagrams of concealed message delivery systems, weighted pendulums within mantelpieces, micro-etched prisms placed behind wall sconces, even hollowed-out bricks in embassy stairwells. Duchamp was not only a messenger, he was an inventor, a mechanical tactician. If I were to hide a message in plain sight, I would hide it in motion. I blinked. "Motion?" Holmes moved to the fireplace and lifted the poker. With deft fingers, he tapped along the base of the grate, then up toward the bracket holding the mantel clock. "You recall the planter on the balcony?" he asked. Of course. It wasn't just for concealment, it was counterweighted, and the crack in the window just thin enough to suggest impact from within. What if the strike came from inside the house, not from the balcony? My eyes widened. "You think Duchamp installed a mechanism that broke the window from within the drawing room?" Holmes nodded, eyes alight now. "Precisely. A spring-loaded arm, perhaps built into the mantel or hidden behind a wall panel, designed to fracture the glass at a precise moment, deliver the note and retract, all while Sir Reginald stepped briefly away." I stood. Then the true mechanism was never in the cracked glass or the mirror, but in the room itself. "And the cipher," Holmes said, "was stored within the device." We stared at each other, realization dawning like sunlight through soot. "Come," Holmes said, already grabbing his coat. "We must return to Porton Terrace, but this time, Watson, we won't be looking at the stage, but we'll be looking beneath it." The house at number 17 was, for once, deserted. Sir Reginald had not yet returned from convalescence, and Beechcroft had arranged access once again, though this time he remained uninvolved. We entered without ceremony, the door closing behind us with a quiet finality. Holmes went straight to the hearth. He knelt before it, studying the base with surgical focus. Then he lifted the rug just before the fireplace, revealing the floorboards beneath. He ran his hands along the grain. "There," he said. He pressed inward. With a dull click, a small section of floor gave way, revealing a cavity no larger than a shoebox. Inside, wrapped in black cloth and secured by brass clamps, was a narrow cylindrical device, clockwork gears faintly visible behind a sliding panel. Holmes lifted it gently. "Watson, this is it, the striker, the delivery mechanism." I leaned in. "It's remarkable." "Indeed, but the cipher must still be hidden within." He examined the device's undercarriage, revealing a thin tray beneath the primary gear assembly. With the edge of a penknife, he slid it open. Inside, protected in waxed paper, lay a folded sheet. Holmes removed it and held it up to the light. Dozens of characters, handwritten in microscopic script, were scrawled across its surface in neat columns, some in French, others in Ottoman Turkish. Coordinates, names, transfers, routes, the kind of intelligence that could collapse alliances if placed in the wrong hands. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, "we are holding not a message, but an entire ledger." "Then the man we chased at Redcliffe, he wasn't a lone saboteur." "No," Holmes said, folding the sheet. "He was a guardian, perhaps even a defector." "And writer?" "A proxy, a mask, one of many, no doubt." I looked around the room, the mirror now replaced, the window mended, the chairs returned to stillness. All this for a secret hidden beneath our feet. Holmes smiled faintly. "Such is the nature of true concealment. It does not require distance, only distraction." He placed the mechanism in a satchel and stood. "Tomorrow we return this to the Foreign Office, but tonight we have silenced the theatre." I nodded slowly. "And the man who spoke in riddles?" Holmes glanced toward the mirror, then back to me. "Let him vanish. The story may yet follow him, but now we hold the script." It was early afternoon the following day when we returned once more to the Foreign Office. The winter sun hung low behind the grey veil of Westminster's stone buildings, and the shadows it cast seemed longer than they ought to be. In my pocket was the revolver, now unneeded but carried out of habit. Holmes, by contrast, bore only a small leather case. Within it, wrapped in wax paper and velvet cloth, lay the full cipher Duchamp's secret, recovered from the heart of the drawing-room mechanism at number 17. Neither of us spoke during the cab ride. The case had wound its way through mirrors and fractured glass, false names and vanishing footprints. Now it rested, delicate as breath, in the crook of Holmes's arm. As we disembarked at the steps of the Foreign Office, I noticed Holmes pause briefly, not with hesitation, but with consideration. "Is there any part of you," I asked, "that wishes we hadn't found it?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. "There is a peculiar temptation," he said at last, "to let certain secrets remain secret, but when men kill to suppress knowledge, it becomes a duty to know why." Inside, Lionel Beechcroft greeted us with more colour in his cheeks than the last time we'd seen him. He ushered us through to a secure conference room, tall walls, heavy curtains, and a fire that added only a flicker of warmth. The mood was quiet, formal. A single empty chair at the table marked the absence of Sir Reginald, who, we were informed, was still recovering at a private residence in Surrey and would not return to duty until the following week. Beechcroft waited until the door was closed behind us. "You have something," he said softly. Holmes gave a single nod and laid the leather case on the table. He opened it with the care of a surgeon revealing an organ for study, then drew out the folded cipher. He placed it atop the green felt and stepped back. "This," he said, "was concealed within a mechanical striker installed beneath the hearth at number 17 Porton Terrace. It was triggered remotely, most likely by Duchamp himself, via a weighted mechanism connected to the planter on the balcony. The cracked glass was not a flaw. It was a premeditated fracture calibrated to deliver a decoy message through theatrical misdirection." Beechcroft leaned over the document but did not touch it. "And this is the real message?" "Not a message," Holmes said. "A dossier, trade routes, arms transfers, names of intermediaries in diplomatic disguise. It is a map of movement, one that stretches from Constantinople to the Channel. Duchamp was no ordinary envoy. He was carrying an entire covert network on his shoulders." Beechcroft swallowed. "And the man we intercepted?" Holmes's gaze narrowed. "Not writer, but someone who has used his identity, or fragments of it, for some time. A custodian. One of the last guards of this particular theatre. And the cipher, was it ever intended for us?" Holmes tilted his head. "I believe it was intended to survive, that's all. Whether it reached the Foreign Office or burned with Duchamp was immaterial to its creator. He knew he might die, and he ensured that the message would not. That's the mark of a strategist, not a courier." Beechcroft stared at the pages for a long time. Then he said, "And what would you advise us to do with it, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He turned and walked to the window where pale sunlight filtered through the lace curtains. Outside, the bells of a nearby church began to chime the quarter hour. He waited until the last note faded. "I advise you," he said finally, "to read it, but not alone. You'll need judgment, not just intelligence. This document is a fulcrum. Handle it wrongly, and it may tip into war." Beechcroft gave a short, humourless laugh. "That seems heavier than even our usual fare." Holmes turned back. "If you think this is over, Mr. Beechcroft, you are mistaken. The man in the tunnel at Redcliffe was not improvising. He was enacting the final line of a script. That tells me there's a curtain yet to fall, and perhaps an encore." That evening, back in Baker Street, Holmes was more subdued than I'd seen him in weeks. The fire crackled low, and the light caught in motes of dust that danced across the ceiling like fading actors. I had set aside my notebook and taken up the Times, but I found myself reading the same paragraph over and over. Holmes sat at his desk, fingers drumming idly against the edge of his chair. The telegram he had received an hour before lay beside him, still unopened. "You haven't read it," I said, gesturing to it. He looked down at the envelope as if he had forgotten it was there. "No," he said. "Not yet." "Why not?" He turned the envelope over, then back again. "Because I suspect it is from him." My blood cooled. "The man from the tunnel?" Holmes gave a slight nod. "A message, perhaps, or a clue. But if so, it means he still watches. That he anticipated the cipher's recovery. That the story he began is not yet finished." I sat forward. "Then we're not done?" Holmes opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of blank paper. No writing, no mark, nothing at all. He held it to the gaslight, then to the fire. Invisible ink, nothing. He even sniffed it. No citrus, no sulphur, no foreign paper scent. Just paper. Holmes smiled. "What is it?" I asked. "It's nothing," he said. "But surely—" He tapped the envelope. "Exactly, it is nothing. That's the message." I frowned. "I don't understand." He rose, stretched his arms slightly, and poured himself a measure of brandy. "He's telling us that the theatre is closed. The script has ended for now." "Do you believe him?" Holmes sipped the brandy and stared into the hearth. "No." I watched him for a moment longer, then turned back to my chair. The case of the window that wouldn't break had closed. The cipher had been found, the actors named, the shadows scattered. But Holmes was right. There were still curtains to rise, and somewhere, beyond the edge of the gaslight, the next scene waited in silence.